After a topsy-turvy weekend, what will the committee reveal about their intentions on Tuesday? You are a big part of the best in discussion, debate, and analysis right here at the Voice of College Football. We appreciate you stopping by. Leave those comments and questions down below. And of course, join us for our big Tuesday watch party with the college football playoff rankings being revealed before rivalry weekend. This is going to be one of the more intriguing playoff reveals that we've seen in recent memory because of what happened over the weekend and some of the narratives involving some of these teams with the SEC kind of floating together. Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Ole Miss have those connections that can't be denied in regards to their play on the field in the conference and head-to-head. And of course, there's the case of Indiana. They didn't get blown out completely. They didn't stay competitive in the game for 4 quarters. What will the committee do with Indiana? Then, of course, the case of the Big 12 with Arizona State rising up, BYU continuing to descend, and the 4 teams playing for conference championship bids this weekend. Here is my prediction on what the committee will unveil on Tuesday night. Let's first review where we stand right now. Oregon's the only undefeated team in college football with Indiana and Army going down. Ohio State came in at number 2. Texas, Penn State, Indiana in the top 5. Of course, the Ducks were off. Ohio State won the big game against Indiana, so that's the first key game right here. The Hoosiers. What will happen to Indiana football after losing its first game 38-15 to Ohio State in its biggest game of the year by far? What will the committee do with Indiana? Penn State squeaked by Minnesota, but you would think with the Gophers being a decent team and Penn State getting the win on the road, that the committee has nothing to do with Penn State in regards to sending them anywhere in particular. Texas had a nice win against Kentucky, but nothing that they really proved against a bad Kentucky team that is now 1-7 in the SEC. Notre Dame could be a big winner here with the Indiana situation and with, of course, a huge 5-touchdown win over Army, but they don't have too many spots to go in regards to their situation. And, of course, they've got a seeding challenge because they cannot win a conference championship. The other 2 enormous situations going on in the top 10, of course, involve Alabama losing, Ole Miss losing. Now, the Ole Miss loss was closer, and the Ole Miss loss was against a team that most people are respecting a bit more these days. Florida coming in with a win over LSU the previous week. But for Bama to completely get annihilated on the road against an Oklahoma team that has struggled mightily coming into the game at 5-5. Bama does not score a touchdown in the game. They lose by 3 touchdowns to a 5-5 Oklahoma team. They were at number 7 with Ole Miss at number 9. And of course, Georgia now has the better record than both of them. And of course, Georgia's got the head-to-head win over Tennessee, as both of those teams, the Dogs and the Vols, are at 9-2. Will we see a 3-loss team play in the college football playoff? Boise State was not impressive, and they're not going to rack up any really meaningful wins the rest of the year in regards to the playoff. They just have to keep winning, and they'll be fine because now Army is out of the way. The other huge situation here over the weekend was, of course, Arizona State continuing to win football games and won its biggest of the year, holding off BYU 28-23. The committee had Arizona State at 21, Iowa State at 22, and both teams won over the weekend and control their own destiny. Although Arizona State won the bigger game against BYU, they already had a 1-spot jump on Iowa State, so you would think that they would ascend higher than Iowa State would, although, again, these rankings are not in a vacuum, so they could just kind of move up together, and we will see what I predict the committee to show us on Tuesday night. Arizona State defeats BYU 28-23, so they'll probably almost displace BYU and make a jump close to where BYU currently is at number 14, and then BYU's going to drop down with a 9-2 record. And then, of course, again, Arizona State and Iowa State control their own destiny to get to the Big 12 championship game, so it doesn't much matter which team is ranked ahead of whom there. Now, there are a few other factors really involved here because I would say the lowest ranked team currently, that can make the college football playoff would be Iowa State at number 22 by way of the Big 12 championship win. But it does matter in regards to what the committee is thinking about these other teams and their impact on the top teams in the country in terms of quality wins and losses. Clemson and South Carolina, that's also an interesting situation. Of course, they play on rivalry weekend coming up. Clemson at 9-2, South Carolina, maybe the hottest team in college football at 8-3. With some impressive wins and impressive losses to a certain extent, although two of those were losses this past weekend as Ole Miss went down. The Rebels beat South Carolina by 24 points. Bama beat them by 2. And then the other factor in here is, of course, who's going to make other teams look good? So who's going to get ranked? There's probably a team or two that weren't ranked last week that will jump into the rankings and aid other teams vying for playoff position. Take Illinois. They're in the rankings at number 25. They won again on a last-second play against Rutgers to go to 8-3. They'll probably defeat Northwestern to finish at 9-3. That's a nice little boost for teams like Penn State in the rankings. And, of course, if there are any other SEC teams that could possibly get into these rankings, look out. LSU at 7-4. If they beat Oklahoma and finish 8-4 in the regular season, we could see them pop into the rankings and help the likes of Alabama and Ole Miss, etc. I have said it many times here at the Voice of College Football when asked who's going to win the Heisman Trophy. I don't like to predict what other people select. I'll predict games, of course, each and every week. Please join us on patreon.com/MarkRogersTV for my predictions. But in regards to predicting what other people are going to select, like Mark, select the AP Top 10 this year. Don't really get into that because that's not necessarily a valid selection. But this is the playoff. This is the one that matters. So let's give it a shot in predicting what the reveal will show us, what the committee is thinking and how they're ranking these teams coming up on Tuesday night. I believe that the top 4 are going to stay in play: Oregon, Ohio State, Texas, Penn State. Then I think Notre Dame jumps to 5, Miami to 6, with Indiana and the SEC teams losing. I've got Georgia at 7, Tennessee at 8. There's the head-to-head issue there with Tennessee, but they really benefited probably more than anybody else with Bama and Ole Miss going down last Saturday. And yes, there's Indiana at number 9. What is the committee going to do with them? How did they evaluate this game against Ohio State? Do they consider that to be a complete beatdown or that they were competitive? It was 14-7.5. I think they're going to drop Indiana to number 9. And of course, Indiana was aided by Bama and Ole Miss losing. Number 10, SMU. They continue to win. They romp Virginia by 26 points. Now, in terms of the rest of the playoff field as it stands in my prediction of what the committee is going to unveil on Tuesday night, Bama drops to number 11, Ole Miss to number 12, then Boise State's at number 13, which is fine for them because they get the group of 5 spot and they move into the top 12, so that would knock out Ole Miss. In terms of the Big 12, I've got Arizona State jumping to number 16 in the country. I've got Iowa State right behind them at number 17, and then BYU at 18. It's much like the conundrum in the SEC. These teams are all 9-2, and they've got very similar resumes. Colorado, of course, suffered a big loss against Kansas by 16 points. They fall to number 21. There you see South Carolina and Clemson. They'll enter their Palmetto State showdown at numbers 14 and 15 in the country. Army is out of it now at 9-1. Forget them. So here are the front runners to possibly jump into the top 25 this weekend. Duke beat Virginia Tech. They're 8-3 now. Their only losses, 2 of them to Miami and then also to SMU in overtime. So Duke's got a decent resume. Syracuse at 8-3. They've got a showdown against Miami at home this weekend that would knock Miami out of the ACC championship game. Kansas State's lost 2 consecutive games before this weekend. They righted the ship against Cincinnati to get to 8-3. Washington State has fallen off. They lost to Oregon State, who's a bad football team that was shut out by a Mountain West team the week before, Air Force. So Washington State at 8-3, but I just listed them because of their decent record. Then some 7-4 teams that could factor in at some point, probably not this week, but if they win their final games, especially if it's Georgia Tech at 7-4 and they beat Georgia, they're going to jump into the rankings for sure. Also, LSU plays Oklahoma, and of course, they've got a tough schedule, and LSU could become a good selling point for Bama, Ole Miss in particular at 7-4, Iowa 7-4, and then you see those teams from the Big 12 come in at 7-4 before this weekend. So that's a prediction of what the committee is going to unveil on Tuesday night based on what they should do, based on what's logical, based on their previous week's rankings, and then factoring in, of course, Saturday's results, and then voila. But I also factored in how the committee thinks, who they favor, who they don't. And again, Indiana's a huge wild card in all this, and Alabama gets all sorts of respect, but now this team has lost to Oklahoma by 3 touchdowns, and a Vanderbilt team that lost to LSU over the weekend to notch another loss for Vandy. So Vandy's a decent team, but are they really that good? No. So Bama's got, in a sense, 2 bad losses. All right, your thoughts, your questions, your comments down below, right here at the Voice of College Football. We'll see you on Tuesday night for the big watch party.